Welcome to Bahá'í Books and Authors, a podcast which introduces to you writers and the works they've penned related to the Bahá'í Faith. We'll explore the inspiration, the process, and the stories behind their work. I'm your host, Jan Grammer. This podcast is produced by World Unity Media, which also produces Bahá'í audiobooks. What does it mean for a poet to write for all people? To believe that poetry can serve humanity without being confined by labels, politics, or time? Robert Earl Hayden was such a poet. He believed that poetry should transcend cultural and racial categories while still confronting historical truth with honesty and depth. His belief in the oneness of humanity shaped both his life and his art. He resisted labels, insisting that he was simply a poet, responsible to truth, beauty, and conscience. He embraced the Bahá'í Faith in 1943 when he was about 30 years old. Robert Hayden is one of America's most profound and principled poets. He was the first African American to serve as consultant in poetry to the Library of Congress, a position now known as United States Poet Laureate. He served for 1976-1977 during America's bicentennial, and again 1977-1978. In January of 1980, Hayden was honored by President Jimmy Carter at a White House reception celebrating American poetry. And in 2012, the U.S. Postal Service issued stamps featuring 10 great 20th century American poets. Robert Hayden was among them. The book is Robert Earl Hayden, A Man, a Pencil, and Poetry for All People. Susan Engle offers an intimate portrait of Hayden's life, from his difficult childhood in Detroit to his rigorous devotion to craft, his moral clarity, and his deep spiritual grounding. Robert Hayden's voice continues to matter deeply in today's world. It's a joy to have the author with us today. Welcome, Susan.
The joy is completely mine.
Your book is part of a larger body of work on creative lives known as the Changemaker series, right now comprising 7 books, 4 of which you've written. Please tell us a little about this series.
That's a great story, at least in my life. I was an associate editor for Brilliant Star magazine for 20-some years. And when I retired, I was feeling lacking in creative outlet, with the sudden change, retirement. But a friend of mine named Bonnie Taylor, who lived in Chicago, had attended a talk with the great-grandniece of Robert Sengstack Abbott, the publisher of the Chicago Defender. And this great-grandniece was begging someone to write a biography of her great-granduncle because every year in August, there's a big parade called the Bud Billiken Parade. Robert Abbott sponsored that first parade, and it's been going ever since the 1940s, I believe, maybe earlier. And so Bonnie was in the audience, and she heard that, and she knew I just retired, and she said, "Susan, write a book." I said, I've written lots of articles, but I've never written a book before. But she encouraged me, and I started researching. Well, about a year later, I visited St. Simon's Island, where he was born, outside of Savannah, Georgia. And I submitted a manuscript to the Baha'i Publishing Trust, and they accepted it. The manager said, this could be the beginning of a series about Baha'is who have served the world in such a way that they're household names. Everyone can recognize Dizzy Gillespie. Hazel Scott, when she was singing, was known throughout the United States. She had a television program, even in the South, which for a Black woman doing basically a single show all by herself was pretty amazing. Everybody tuned in the United States. So these people had an effect on the culture outside of simply their being Baha'is, which is not a simple thing. It's a big thing, but they had their fingers on the pulse of creativity in this country. So that was the idea. Let's have a series of biographies that librarians and teachers would like to use for their classrooms, put on their shelves. Parents would encourage their children to read. So it's a wonderful way to reach people about why did these particular people turn to the Baha'i faith.
What first drew you to him, not just as a poet, but as a human being whose life is best understood alongside his work?
Well, I have to say, I didn't know much about Robert Hayden before I began the research into his life. But the more I researched, one quality that really stood out to me was his amazing perseverance. He had challenges as a child, as a Black man in a white world, as a poet struggling to find time to commit to his art. He was a full-time professor, a husband, a father, member of the Bahá'í community. His time was so taken up by the things he needed to do that he had very little time to do what he wanted to do, which was write poetry. So I was impressed by that, but also the fact that he rose from very difficult beginnings. His family was poor. He didn't think he could get an education, but his foster father encouraged him and asked him to live a life that would be different from the life his foster father, had growing up. That was very inspiring also.
How do you think his early years and the difficulties that he faced shaped rather than limited his artistic voice?
Robert Hayden didn't see well, so he spent a lot of time growing up by himself. He wasn't an athlete. He loved reading, he loved the stage, he loved movies, he loved anything to do with words, but he was not the kind of kid who went out and played baseball out in the street with his buddies. So he was sort of stood apart. But the fact that he could not see well really sharpened his sense of hearing, and he began to internalize the way people spoke. He loved music, so he internalized the rhythms and the silences, the phrasing of music, and those things really influenced the poetry that he began to write later on in his life.
Being a creative yourself, in writing music, in singing music, how do you feel discipline supports creativity?
It's important for many writers to carve out time, especially for their craft. It gives them a sense of continuity. It helps shape the actual piece of art that you're working on. I'm not sure, but I do believe that Mr. Hayden relied upon his spirituality to connect to creativity. You know, the Baha'i Faith talks about the arts and sciences are inspired by souls who have left this world already, and to connect to those souls helps one form one's ideas and thoughts. And you have to do that regularly. You have to make it a habit. Though he didn't have much time to himself, he relished those moments when he could spend thinking, being inspired, putting words together in just the exact right way. You know, he would spend years crafting a poem, and then once it was published, he'd revise it. Sometimes he would publish the same poem in a new form. He was completely immersed in the form of poetry. He felt that poets are born, that you don't necessarily become a poet, but you have that potential in you from the time you enter this world.
What a lovely answer, thank you. In what ways do you think his spiritual convictions as a Baha'i appear in his poetry?
Luckily, Dr. Derek Smith and Dr. John Hatcher have both written amazing books about this very topic. It's really hard to condense into one thought, but Robert Hayden addresses it himself. He says, as a Baha'i, I am committed to belief in the fundamental oneness of all races, the essential oneness of men, to the vision of world unity. And these are increasingly powerful influences on my poetry today. During the 1960s, the Black Arts movement became prominent, especially on the campus of Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee, where Robert Hayden was a professor. Because Black people have been so oppressed in this country that they felt that it was time for Black people to express themselves in their own way, to inspire one another, to support the rise of the dignity of African Americans in this country. And they felt that to do that, they had to speak in a particular way, present themselves in a particular form of poetry. And Mr. Hayden embraced his culture. He embraced the fact that he was a Black man, but he wanted to be known as an American poet. He said something like, John Keats was an Irishman, but you don't think of John Keats as an Irish poet. He is simply a poet, and that is what he wanted to be. He wanted to be judged on his own merits as a man. And that didn't sit well with especially young people who are rising with a new voice. And so there was a great lack of understanding as to what Robert Hayden was trying to accomplish. And eventually, he left Fisk University for the University of Michigan because he simply didn't feel like he could teach people who didn't appreciate or understand what he was trying to do.
In the subtitle of the book, you say that he was a poet for all people.
From the beginning of his life, Robert Hayden was surrounded by a diverse community. He grew up in Detroit in a section called Paradise Valley. It was basically families who were not wealthy at all. They were very poor. Poverty touches all cultures. It doesn't stick with one group in particular. I just wanted to read a little tiny bit about Robert Hayden and his neighbors. The kids in the neighborhood were mostly African Americans, but Robert met children from several different cultures and countries as well. He says, I never had any trouble relating to people around me. I ate halwa and smoked fish in the homes of Jewish kids. I went to school with Italians, Greeks, and Poles. At the age of 12 or 13, I even knew a few words of Chinese. So from the very beginning, he was surrounded by people that he knew and cared about were from many different cultures, and it just stuck with him. And of course, meeting up with the Bahá'í faith and learning that mankind is one, we're all one family, simply reinforced that idea. And he held on to it regardless of what others thought about it.
Are there aspects of his life that especially seem relevant in today's cultural climate?
Robert and Irma, his wife, both looked beyond contention and conflict, which is such a part of this culture. Whenever they met people, interacted with people, they were looking for points of unity and understanding. I think that is completely relevant. We need to listen to each other, to understand that we are brothers and sisters in every sense of the word.
After learning about Robert Hayden, has your understanding of poets or poetry changed?
Robert Hayden had a teacher in college. His name was W.H. Auden. When Robert Hayden met W.H. Auden, Mr. Auden had this philosophy about poetry. He said, right now, you're writing poetry like arithmetic. You're stating 2 plus 3 equals 5. But poetry today needs to be more like algebra. You have to solve for the unknown, which is X. So you need to expect that your reader will have to work a little bit to understand the references you're making, to integrate that poetry into his thinking, into his heart. And Robert Hayden really appreciated that, and his poetry changed. I write poetry for children, and I'm a 2 plus 3 equals 5 kind of poet, because children, they like structure, they like the storytelling. Sometimes kids can get thrown off if you don't make things clear. So I really understand the arithmetic versus the algebra. And I love that it really helped Robert Hayden come to his own voice and his own thinking in poetry.
There's definitely a place for both simple math and algebra in poetry. What do you hope readers of your book will feel while reading it and how it might influence their own lives?
I really hope that reading about Mr. Hayden and all of these beautiful souls who have contributed to the world will inspire kids to search out their own unique gifts. So reading about Mr. Hayden and the trials and tribulations of his childhood, growing up, and his adulthood, I think it may inspire other hearts to tread the path of service. In fact, when I was a kid, biographies were my meal of choice. I really wanted role models. I wanted to see how people reach their goals and were of service to other people.
This book invites us not only to read Robert Hayden's poems carefully, but to live more thoughtfully and to consider how our own words, chosen with care, might serve something greater than ourselves. Thank you so much, Susan, for being with us today.
It is such a pleasure not only to connect with people outside of my little house here where I write, but especially with you, Jan.
Thank you. Robert Earl Hayden, A Man, a Pencil, and Poetry for All People, by Susan Engle, is available through the Bahá'í Bookstore and other book distributors. Subscribe or follow Bahá'í Books and Authors on your favorite podcast platform. This podcast is produced by World Unity Media.